Roll call, please.
Councilmember Francisco.
Here.
Hart.
Here.
Hotchkiss.
Here.
Murillo. Rouse.
Here.
White. Mayor Snyder.
Here. And any public comment for items not on the upcoming agenda? I don't see any. No. Okay, so I'll close that part of the public comment. And I believe, are we doing items 15 and 16 together? So if you could read both items 15 and 16.
Item 15, vacation rental enforcement and home sharing ordinance. Item 16, issuance of legislative subpoena to support vacation rental enforcement, recommending that council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara issuing subpoenas for certain records related to short-term vacation rentals in the city.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Buell or Ms. Limon or yes, Mr. Buell.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor, members of the Council. I'm George Buell, Community Development Director, and we are again revisiting the issue of vacation rentals here in Santa Barbara. As a matter of background, you will very likely recall that back in June, we presented to the Council a whole host of information that included providing you with existing policies and regulations. We provided vacation rental and home sharing regulations that are in other communities. We talked about those pros and cons with those, with what happens, what we're seeing happen with short-term rentals, and we also provided, I believe it was 4 options for council to consider in how we go forward. Resulting from that, we received the direction that you see on the screen right now. 1, enforce existing zoning regulations for short-term rentals. 2, develop an approach for proactive zoning enforcement, and develop a work program to commence a zoning ordinance amendment to allow home sharing. Tonight's presentation will be, again, similar to last time. We'll provide a definition of terms. We'll talk about the enforcement priorities and the approach, and we'll also get into home sharing ordinances, process, and schedule, and we'll be presenting to you a funding request. At the outset, similar to last time, I'd like to make sure that we're all on the same page with regards to terms that we use. And it's not necessarily that these will be the definitions that you would like to see going forward, but for the purposes of conversation this evening, that we can all use the same terminology, whether that's staff, council, members of the public. And if there's some variation thereof, that's fine. But for the purposes of our presentation and conversation, we'd like to have a clear understanding of these terms. And those are, one, just to make sure that everybody understands that short-term rentals, whether they're vacation rentals or home sharing, are a transient use. Transient use is something that's identified as where people essentially pay money to stay for less than 30 days. And with regards to a vacation rental is a rental of an entire dwelling where the host does not live there while the guest does. A home sharing rental, on the other hand, is a place where somebody would pay to stay. The owner or primary resident would be there during the entire length of the stay. And those fundamental differences are important for our conversation. With regard to enforcing existing regulations, we did a substantial amount of research since June 23rd. We looked through all the internet resources that we could, and we discovered that there are at least 90 separate websites that advertise vacation rentals and home sharing rentals here in Santa Barbara. We also, through the City Attorney's Office, researched legislative subpoenas, and as you can see, an example of one has been included with your staff report. And in looking at the enforcement, we would anticipate that we could handle about 300 cases per year over a 2 to 3 year period. And the objectives would be to achieve compliance with zoning regulations and to recover unpaid transient occupancy taxes. With regards to the priorities that we would be implementing, once authorized by council, we would be looking at the number one priority would go after existing and new complaints. These are people who are operating vacation rentals that don't have any type of license or paying tax with the city, but brand new to the city. We would set that as the number one priority. Second priority would be rentals in these zoning districts that you see on the screen. Just to be clear, these are all the zoning districts that are residential zoning districts in which, or zoning districts in which residential properties may be built, but home sharing vacation rentals are not currently allowed. And the third priority would be rentals in R4 and commercial zones. Those, and just a point of clarification, commercial zones, and it would be any other non-residential zoning district. We generically call it commercial zones, but it could be an industrial zone. But we would set as priority where there's no business license and not paying TOT in the R4 and other non-residential zoning districts. And let me just point of clarification, going back up to number 2, I apologize. These zoning districts that you see on the screen, it would be those places that there is no business license and they're not paying TOT. Then skipping to number 4, rentals in the zoning districts that you see on the screen where they do have a business license and where they are paying TOT. And then fifth would be rentals in the R4 and other non-residential zoning districts. In essence, those are zoning districts where, again, vacation rentals or home sharing rentals or vacation rentals could be allowed today under the code if they were permitted. Now, with respect to developing a home sharing ordinance, in the process of doing so, we would set definitions. We would just determine what would be allowed, how to regulate and tax home share operations. We would anticipate an approximate 1-year review period, and this would be going through the Planning Commission workshop this fall. Just to be clear, the Planning Commission workshop, that would be open to the public. It would be a place where we could take input from people similar to what we might have in the room here today, where the Planning Commission could then receive testimony from the public so that they could get their minds around the issue. And then we would look at drafting an ordinance throughout the winter of 2015, and then returning to the Planning Commission in the spring with that draft ordinance for their consideration. At a point where the Planning Commission would be comfortable making a recommendation to the City Council, they would do that, and we anticipate that would be in the summer of it would go to summer 2016, where it would be reviewed by the Ordinance Committee, and then finally to the City Council fall 2016. These are rough approximation of timeframes. If it's apparent that we could move more expeditiously, we will. If the process gets more convoluted and bogged down for some reason, then it would take longer. With regard to TOT collection, for the time being, we continue to collect TOT from existing rental operators until enforcement takes place. We would see no new vacation rental applications. We're accepting no new vacation rental applications. This is for business license. Right now, we're seeing revenue of about $1.2 million in transient occupancy tax, and this will diminish over time, especially as enforcement were to be implemented progressively. The budget request, the total request is for $180,000 as broken down here on the screen. The City Attorney's Office anticipates bringing in contract counsel. This would be the equivalent of a Deputy City Attorney working alongside with the City Attorney in the enforcement and prosecution aspects of the enforcement. And then for community development, my department, $90,000 for additional code enforcement resources and $10,000 for the finance department. That is essentially for overtime to cover costs related to staff doing calculations related to the TOT owed and collections. Staffing would, if necessary, it would be reassessed in the process of the fiscal 2017 budget process. Now we're at a point where we'd be talking about legislative subpoenas, and I'm going to turn this over to the City Attorney, who will take you through the balance of the presentation.
Well, legislative subpoena is no different than any other kind of subpoena, except that it's issued by the City Council. You have power under your charter and under state law to do that. The point of the subpoena is to gather factual information from the websites about where vacation rentals are happening in Santa Barbara. That will let us look at those locations to determine whether, in fact, we have a compliance issue that we need to move forward with. So we've gone ahead in anticipation of the Council's funding action and proposed a legislative subpoena for issuance tonight by resolution of the City Council. Mr. Doimus has done that work, and he can address the questions more specifically if there are any. Let me back up and talk a little bit about the funding. In our case, roughly 9 to 10% of our budget is allocated for code enforcement. $80,000 represents almost a 50% increase in that, so it would then comprise about 14-15% of our budget over the next year. through this fiscal year. We would be coming back to the City Council in the 2017 mid-year budget to address funding if we needed to do that. Likewise, the estimate of the number of cases we can handle, the 300 per year, is just that. It's an estimate. I think it's realistic, but it will mean a substantial effort both from the community development staff, finance staff, and our office. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have any.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Would this be part of or separate to a cease and desist letter?
This would be before a cease and desist letter. So this would be to attempt to identify who the subjects of the enforcement actions might be.
And do these go to the 90-plus operations that are now marketing vacation rentals?
Yes, it's an attempt to get a customer list, essentially.
And do we expect them to comply or to stonewall?
I think some will comply, some will not.
Thank you.
Mr. Hart?
Have you looked into experience in other communities as to that point specifically? You know, are the largest companies complying?
Yes. Malibu's experience is that the largest companies are complying, and I expect that the smaller operations may be responsive even without a subpoena. In other words, a call might generate records. There's certainly going to be customer privacy issues that they're concerned with. That's why the power of a subpoena is important.
So the point of the subpoena is to collect the information, to know what the universe of operators are, and then to send them all a letter explaining where the city is in terms of its new approach, regulatory approach?
No, Mr. Buell identified enforcement priorities, and with the enforcement priorities represent our response to the council's discussion of amnesty back in June. The council was interested in phasing in enforcement so that people who have attempted to play by the rules such as they are, meaning operators who've gotten business licenses and who have been remitting transient occupancy tax, would have some period of time to wind down their business operations. So what we've done, rather than propose a formal amnesty, is to suggest that as a matter of enforcement priority, those would be the last operators we would be looking to shut down.
I understand the priority and the real limitations on staffing and the legal process and all of that. Is there a step to just notify everybody that this isn't okay anymore?
I'm hesitant to say notify everybody, but yes, there will be notice before there's any enforcement action. In other words, the operators are not going to face a threat of litigation if they are cooperative with code compliance officers.
I guess what I'm saying, I think I keep missing it here, is that, you know, we're going to do some subpoena. We're going to get a list of all the people that are operating vacation rentals, and then we're going to begin to enforce against them in the priority order that you've described, in the way that you've described. But is there an additional first step beyond that to send a notice to everybody to say, you know, the council has changed its approach to operations of vacation rentals, you should be advised that it is not legal to operate?
I hadn't envisioned that, but that's something we could do. The reason I hadn't envisioned that is managing 1,000+ responses will be more than I think we can reasonably handle. So I was trying to phase this in a cycle of basically 40 or so every 6 weeks, so that we could manage them in batches and keep up administratively with the workload.
Okay, I think I understand. Thank you.
Please, was there anything else to your presentation?
No, that's all I had.
Okay, back to Mr. Buell.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, with respect to our enforcement goals, one is to achieve permanent compliance with the zoning, and two, to recover unpaid taxes. Again, vacation rentals are unlawful in all single-family zones, and pardon me.
Okay, sorry, this slide is a point of clarification, Madam Mayor and council members. We had referred to on our original staff reports and resolutions to the single-family zones being R1, which is kind of a generic term to describe all R1 zoning designations. But in our city, it's much more complicated than that, and it involves the A1, A2, E1, E2, E3, and R1 and R2 zones. So this is just showing the corrections, and you have a revised resolution before you today specifically outlining all of the zones that would be considered single-family. The legislative subpoena also was revised to list the entire range of the single-family zones in the city, as well as the council resolution. And you have substitute pages before you tonight.
And then finally is staff's recommendation. It is fivefold. 1, to initiate a zoning ordinance amendment to allow home sharing rentals. 2, to allocate $80,000 to the city attorney's office fiscal 16 budget. Similarly, to allocate $90,000 to the community development budget for this fiscal year, and $10,000 to finance department's fiscal 16 budget, and to adopt a resolution issuing subpoenas for records. That concludes staff's presentation. Be happy to answer any questions.
One question that's come up to me in terms of, I guess, prioritization and timing, because the council said we're interested in at least looking at a home sharing option. If a new homeowner wants to start a home sharing scenario, is that different than saying would we allow for that? Or where would that fall in the enforcement prioritization? That's different than someone wanting to get a business license for a vacation rental scenario. So
you're saying that this person would start an operation
right. So
without...
it's a question of, I was thinking next week I might start a home sharing and work through Airbnb or something like that. But but because you said we're not going to accept any new business license for vacation rentals, does that also apply to someone who's thinking about a home sharing scenario? I mean, what was I didn't know the answer to that question, so I'm asking it.
That's a good question. Let me just kind of work through that a little bit, if I may. Is this a situation where somebody had started that operation and a complaint came in? Because if that's the case, then it would be the first priority.
No. I'm not talking. I'm talking about. I've never done home sharing before. I kind of like the idea the council's looking at perhaps amending their zoning ordinance to allow for it. Mm-hmm. Do I have to wait until that ordinance is in place a year from now, or can I, like everyone else out here, as long as I get a business license, pay my TOT, and it's not a vacation rental, it's my house.
Yeah.
I'm here when they're visiting.
Yeah. If the visitors are staying less than 30 days,
right.
That would be home sharing, and that's not allowed under the code today.
I know, but.
And if somebody were to do that, we would not issue a business license. We would not collect TOT. And if somebody were to complain, they would be in the first tier of the enforcement priority.
Okay. Now I'm not being clear, I guess. And what, Mr. Casey, do you get where I'm coming from?
I think I do. I think our staff's answer would be we wouldn't condone people starting a new operation that's not compliant with the zoning ordinance. Now, we're working on the ordinance, and when the ordinance is in place, then we would welcome people to follow the rules. But I don't think we should be encouraging people to start new operations that aren't in compliance with the zoning ordinance today.
Because I wanted to be, because the slide said you're not going to allow for new applications for vacation rentals, but you also mean you're not going to allow new applications for home sharing.
Got it.
Yes. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That's what you meant?
Yes.
Okay. And then the timeline that you had when you said there was a workshop from the Planning Commission and then a draft ordinance amendment. Is that to council, the draft ordinance amendment? Is that a public hearing? Where it's whatever slide that is. Meaning, is it going to come back to council before it goes off to the Planning Commission hearing?
Go ahead.
Our proposed work program is to have a workshop with the Planning Commission to go over all the various iterations of home sharing and how other cities do it. Cover a lot of the ground that we've covered with the City Council, and have the public come out and participate in that workshop so they can hear a lot of what you're going to probably hear tonight. Then staff would go away and try to draft an ordinance that would be responsive to what the Planning Commission and Council have said. We would return to the Planning Commission to review the draft ordinance, have the CEQA review, have the formal hearings before the Planning Commission. They would make a recommendation to the City Council.
Okay. All right, well, and maybe this is more for comments, but just to put out there, depending on how that works, we may, since it takes 5 council members to amend the zoning ordinance, it may be worth doing a touch base here, making sure that you're on the right track with what we're thinking, or at least we're on the right track before you spend months going through the Planning Commission Ordinance Committee before it comes back. Just a thought. But maybe things will be, everyone's going to agree on everything. It'll be just great. I kind of doubt that. Okay. Any other questions, Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Could you go back to the slide, the second one from the last on applicable zones? So aren't R2 and R3 included in these ones in which vacation rentals would be off limits? So shouldn't that be in there also? There are certain multifamily zones as well.
Right, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, you are correct. R2 and R3 zones would also be, vacation rentals are prohibited in those zones as well. This slide was trying to note a correction to specifically in the legislative subpoena where we referred to single-family zones and omitted several other single-family zones. So R2 and R3 would also complete this list.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to make a request I've made before when we go through these zoning issues, and that is to have a glossary or a slide with all the different little arcane definitions of what all these zones mean, because it isn't clear to all of us up here, let alone everybody out there, what we're talking about. So please do that in the future.
And just so everyone knows, it goes to the Planning Commission because that's our process when we want to amend the zoning ordinance. That any kind of zoning ordinance amendment goes through the Planning Commission. So this isn't anything special. I'm just saying that just so people understand the city process here. Okay. All right. So any other questions before we go to public comment? Okay. All right. So I'm going to reiterate what I said the last time this item came up. There's a lot of people in the room. We want to hear what everyone has to say and pay attention to the content. We would appreciate no cheers or jeers either way, so we can really focus on the content. I know there's a variety of opinions about this issue, whether it's all in the room or elsewhere. We've been getting a variety of opinions about this, so we want to respect people's opinions. And it's not as packed as it was the last time, but I will ask that you keep the entrance there open and free and clear. Our fire marshal really appreciates that. So I'm going to, there's 2 minutes here at the podium, and I'm going to call 3 people up. You'll hear your name in the next 2, and if you hear your name as coming up to speak, if you can be close to the podium so we can keep things moving, that would be appreciative. So I'm going to just call your name in order. So we're going to start with Tom Woodrow, followed by Joel Olgren, and then Michael Conway.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council. Tom Woodrow, City Watch. I was listening to staff report just now, and here are some of the terms that I heard. Taxes, regulations, licenses, permits, the legal process, threat of litigation, enforcement action, prosecution, cooperation, legislative subpoenas, cease and desist, compliance issues, funding actions, subjects of enforcement actions, regulatory approach, shutdown, and amnesty. So my point is that I implore the council to take a step back and do what Palo Alto did in March of this year, which was take no action unless you have from your staff report an inordinate number of complaints that this isn't working very well for Santa Barbara. Have there been a rash of complaints? Do you have information, or is it anecdotal? What's the difference? What about home exchanges? Some people live here half-time, and they go somewhere else half-time, and another part of their family lives here half-time. How much money does short-term rentals bring to the economy? That's a good question. How much? I haven't heard staff report on that. I think it's probably significant. And wouldn't it be better if City College in that area up there on the Mesa were short-term rentals instead of people having 10 cars to an apartment? Isn't having a choice a good thing, an American thing, when you want to come stay in Santa Barbara, that you could stay in a short-term rental?
What I'm sorry. What I just said, I'll stop the clock. I'm serious about, really, please. We want to hear what people have to say. there are a lot of people here with different opinions, and we want to respect everyone's opinion, and your clapping or jeering or whatever is not helpful for us in really hearing what you have to say. So I understand you might agree with what was just said, but I'm asking you to please let us really focus on the public comment. Thank you.
Do I have any time left, Madam Mayor?
Seconds left.
Thanks so much. Look, I appreciate we all love Santa Barbara. We love the community. We love the nature here. But I just think it behooves staff to really look and see, is this really changing the character of our community? Apparently, Palo Alto, which is a nice community up north, didn't think so. They didn't think the issue was urgent enough. And when I read all those adjectives, it just seems to me that you're jumping into a hot water of regulation and enforcement and all this other stuff. And unless you have some really concrete reason, the way you did when we discussed recreational vehicles, I think perhaps you need to step back.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Joel Olgren will be followed by Michael Conaway and then Bill Boyd.
First, I want to thank the council for recognizing that existing residents, full-time residents, and new full-time residents appreciate the fact that you're going to enforce the zoning law. That's really important for the nature of our neighborhoods. In order to demonstrate my point, I want to talk about a program that people often do when they go to a retreat or a business conference where someone is trying to talk about decision making. They show a video. Before they show the video, they say, we're going to have 5 basketball players passing a basketball around in this room. And we want you to count how many passes there are. There's 1 basketball, 5 players. At the end, we'll ask you how many you think you saw. And the video goes ahead. Everybody watches the video. Councilman Maria's seen this, watches the video. At the end of the video, they say, okay, how many passes did you see? 12, 15, 36, 20, whatever it was. Did you see anything else? Someone raises their hand. Well, I saw a gorilla go through the basketball passers. How many of you saw the gorilla? The hands go up. It's between 20 and 30% of the people who actually saw the gorilla. What you're doing today is you're identifying the basketball players and the passes. That's just people out here who are illegally renting their places out. You're not going after the gorilla. The gorilla are these agencies that advertise all of these units. They're the people who are essentially the rental agents. They're getting significant amount of money out of each one of these operations, and it proliferates from community to community to community. So, in effect, if you want to stop it, what you should do is take the subpoena approach, but in addition, send notices out to those people. This is not legal in our community. Don't advertise. And if they do, you can take action against them. There's lots of ways of doing that.
Thank you. Michael Conaway, Bill Boyd, and then Catherine Wolf.
Hi, my name is Mike Conaway, and I just have a personal story. Since 1987, my wife and I have permanently resided in our only home, which is on Cliff Drive, recently renting approximately 70 nights a year and always paying transient occupancy taxes. We feel it has enabled us to stay in Santa Barbara and improve our home, but has given us revenue to help our children attend college and has enabled people from all over the world to enjoy Santa Barbara at an affordable rate. Our rentals are different from home sharing. We rent to families in an intimate, multi-generational setting, which by definition does not have us sitting in the house while they are visiting. We have excellent relations with our neighbors who are friends. We have strict policies regarding who we rent to. We closely impact and monitor proper behavior. We feel our renting benefits the city of Santa Barbara by the transient occupancy taxes, and these can help the city enforce the rules and ordinances concerning vacation rentals. I provided each one of you a copy of the article about the city of Petaluma recently passing a vacation rental ordinance after more than a year of study. I feel their situation mirrors what we have here in Santa Barbara and would work well. A couple examples: they have a business license, TOT taxes, stiff penalties up to $1,000 for noise and public nuisance violations, and limit homes to 90 cumulative days of rentals a year if the owner is not present, which of course is my situation. And that is a strong deterrent, I believe, to speculative owners removing year-round rental properties from our citizens. The definition of vacation rentals requires study and as proposed by the city staff recommendation. I would appreciate an opportunity to participate during this process of exploring ways to regulate and permit home sharing rentals. This, I feel, will likely require new ordinance and amendments to current zoning definitions. Thank you for your time.
Bill Boyd, Catherine Wolf, then Dick Buford.
Madam Mayor and members of council, I have read the full staff report prior to the meeting, and I fully concur with the approach that the staff has taken. I think the prioritization system is a sound one. I think the need for funding is essential in order to get enforcement officers out there on the street. I think that the approach that the city attorney has recommended in terms of identifying who the violators are is also appropriate, and I think that the major benefit to the city that I love, will be that our neighborhoods will be protected from the potential of somebody just coming in and doing what they choose to do without having any respect for next-door neighbors. Thank you.
Catherine Wolf, Dick Buford, then Eric Kelly.
Hello. I'm requesting the proposed program to include new vacation rentals. There will always be new individuals requesting this. It is likely many may vacation rent without paying the TOT. I just think this isn't going to go away. This is here to stay. The internet is here to stay. The world is dealing with this problem. And I think it would be better if we do regulate it and know that there are always going to be new people coming in doing this. So why not have it regulated? As a member of my neighborhood and a landlord for 2 long-term properties in town, which will remain long-term, my partner and I encourage having vacation rentals in Santa Barbara. In the near future, we would like to legally vacation rent our home for 90 days or less a year. In regards to our neighbor concerns, we have no intention of irritating our beloved neighbors. We have lived here 22 years. Our 2 oceanfront Hawaii vacation rentals have given us experience in rules regarding noise and disruptive practices by vacationers. We do not tolerate any disrespectful behavior and have not had a problem in our 15 years of vacation rental experience. This needs to be stated and emphasized up front, and neighbors are encouraged to call us with problems day or night, and the police as necessary. And as I've stated, we've never had a problem in 15 years. So I just want to encourage noting that this isn't going to go away, so why not have something in place that we can regulate? I really support conditional vacation rentals in Santa Barbara. Thank you.
Dick Buford, Eric Kelly, then Brian Smith.
Madam Mayor, council members, my name is Dick Buford. I've been a resident along with my wife and family since 1989. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to read my comments because I want to get it all in. You've heard a good deal about commentary from homeowners about the economic advantages they've enjoyed through home sharing model. Extra money for home improvements, money for grandkids, money for necessary bills, money for housing expenses. And I'm sure that some of these decisions to convert their home to commercial purposes have been driven by necessity. But there is no doubt that among those over 1,000 listings in Santa Barbara, many and perhaps most have been driven primarily by opportunism. As just one example, in 2013, a long-term local contractor applied for and received a building permit for a single-family residential home directly across from my home. This contractor told a neighbor that he was building a home for himself and his family. Yet even before the building had passed its final inspection or received approval for occupancy, the contractor had, using Airbnb, had leased out the 3 bedrooms, including an unpermitted outbuilding called a Serenity Pod. Business at this place has been very brisk. This new home is masquerading as a home share rather than as a working hotel that it really is. There is no financially distressed family here seeking extra income, but an investor contractor fooling with the city and his fictitious neighbors for his own profit. The property's actual neighbors, me included, must suffer through the noise and the nuisances of this activity. The neighborhood suffers from the erosion of a purely residential character and even potentially a decline in their long-term value of their property. And finally, the market for available single-family homes for working families withers even further. I think this should stop.
Thank you.
We're at.
Thank you very much. Eric Kelly, Brian Smith, and then Judy Blankenship.
Hello, Madam Mayor, members of the council. My name is Eric Kelly. My wife and I have operated Painted Pony Bungalow, a vacation rental in Santa Barbara, for about the last 6 years. My other hat is I'm the owner of the Book Den. So my concerns go a couple of different ways. For the record, neither the house that we rent out now nor the house we're living in now was ever a long-term rental, so we actually have not removed anything from the market. But I get the concerns and I get the zoning issues and so on. I was very gratified to see the priorities listed in enforcement, and we fall in number 4. We've been following the rules as they were given to us, and we will go out of business and you will not be enforcing anything against us. But I think it's important that you be clear with the timetables and when enforcement are going to begin. By giving out business licenses and collecting TOT, you have actually encouraged people to go into this business. Some of them have bought homes and will have to sell them. So, cut us a break on that. Now, the flip side is that, I run a bookstore. It's increasingly a tourist business. And I think it's a shame that we don't have a way to actually have the vacation rental experience worked out in our town legally. So what I would encourage you to do is look at the R4 zones, and because there are a lot of houses in those zones still, and something like a vacation rental would be illegal use. But the business license restrictions for hotels and motels and so on are rather onerous for somebody operating just one unit. There's no economy of scale to make somebody who's only renting out one house perform the way a 20-unit motel or a 100-unit hotel would. So, we've got our tenant right now is a grandmother. She's been here for the last 4 years. She comes to visit her grandchildren. They live in a very, very small house. They could not possibly stay with her. They get to stay with her because she's
Thank
here.
you.
Thanks.
Brian Smith will be followed by Judy Blankenship, then Brooke Meek.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of council. My question is, what is the driving force in this quick rush to shut down vacation rentals? I think the lead up to the initial meeting was that there was a housing shortage and a lack of housing authority and other affordable housing units, and that vacation rentals were harming that process. The other thing we heard was noise and nuisances, and then there's been some message about economic impacts. So I think it's curious that there doesn't seem that there's really been any studies done on any of these. As far as the housing shortage, the biggest housing shortage problem has been caused by City College, 10,000 new students in 10 years. That has changed the west side, it's changed the Mesa, it's changed the east side. And we've created our own Isla Vista in some of the areas around City College. 2, noise and nuisances. The economic impact report the staff report for the June meeting talked about a total of 60 complaints over 10 years, 1 every 2 months. That doesn't seem to be a big problem. I know that they've accelerated recently. And then the question of what is the economic impact of the city of Santa Barbara to short-term rentals. Those studies can be done. How many people go to restaurants, to markets, on tours, and accessory businesses that are supported by those visitors. Additionally, generally middle-income people are the people that stay in vacation rentals. It's families. I have a vacation rental. I rent to a family with 2 kids that come to visit family that can't stay with family members in town. They come for a short vacation. They come here to walk on the beach and enjoy their environment. Hotels don't provide that same kind of environment. You're in a small room, 120 square feet. You're paying $250 to $400 a night on weekends, and it puts a huge economic burden on those people. So I think you should consider the people that we are basically going to lose in Santa Barbara. We're going to lose those people coming to town.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Judy Blankenship, Brooke Meek, and then Chris Bender.
Thank you for approaching this whole subject. I just think it's something that definitely needs to be controlled. I'm a little bit behind. I apologize. I was not able to attend the previous meetings because I was out of town, and I'm still a little bit unclear about the vacation sharing versus vacation rentals. I think when you are sharing your own home, either renting a spare bedroom to a student or doing an exchange, maybe going on vacation and letting somebody stay in your home, that's a totally different subject than somebody who is actually running a business and only using this home as a vacation rental and not occupying it as their own residence. And a point in case, I'd like to share a personal story. My son, his wife, and their 2-year-old child rented from VRBO 2 different houses in Hawaii over a 2-week period. Their son, 2 years old, had little bites on him. They didn't pay too much attention. They came home. We discovered it was bed bugs. And they brought home bed bugs to my house, to their house, probably on the airplane and probably in the rental car that they used, because there was no control, no health inspections or anything when a private home is being constantly rented as a vacation rental. And the owners are never there to see what's going on. He had no recourse. It cost him thousands of dollars to fumigate their house. It cost them thousands of dollars in things they had to throw away because they didn't feel it was safe for their child any longer. The RBO would take absolutely no responsibility. And of course, the 2 homeowners in the homes that they stayed in took no responsibility and said that it couldn't possibly have happened in their home. So that's just one more, I think, thing that needs to be looked into and definitely controlled in vacation rentals.
Brooke Meek, Chris Bender, and then Brian Kenny.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and council members. My name is Brooke Meek. I own Santa Barbara Vacation Rentals. Just to speak to that last comment that was made, I don't know if any of you have heard of sand fleas, but you pick them up at the beach and you bring them back to the house, and it actually causes a big issue for the owner and any renters after that. So I don't think that it's always a case of bed bugs, as it could be sand fleas that are brought in from the beaches. But I thought that was an interesting comment she made, so I wanted to comment on it. I'm in strong opposition of you guys subpoenaing documents and information from us, because I feel like it's excessive, it's unnecessary, and it's a violation of privacy. So I would like to let you know I'm in opposition of that and ask, I guess, why that would be necessary to have. We've all been compliant, I think, all along, all of us operators, when you've asked for information and given it to you guys, with ease. And I think this is a little excessive, the subpoena documents. The other thing I wanted to comment on is the amnesty period, why there hasn't been a defined amnesty period. People did buy homes here with this in mind. And you as a city voted to collect TOT. You voted to give licenses out. You voted to allow this, even though it is against the zoning ordinance. I completely understand that. But where's the responsibility from you guys as the ones who have allowed this? The city's allowed it. So why not give these people a period of time to wind down, to be able to sell their homes and rectify this issue? So I'd like to please consider some sort of a definition of an amnesty period rather than leave it kind of ambiguous of, we're not going to set one, or we're not sure when, what the definition of it needs to be defined, just in all fairness. And I would also ask that you please still consider fair regulation. It just seems a little irrational to go in this direction rather than where's the, economic impact study? Why hasn't it been produced by you guys?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Chris Bender, Brian Kenny, then David Bolton.
Madam Mayor, City Council members, thank you very much for allowing me to speak with you today. My name is Chris Bender. I am a general manager with a property management company. I represent homeowners that have gone through the process that you have approved, getting the business license. They've also paid their TOT tax, and they've also been very aware of the community, the environment around them, and making sure that everything that they've done correctly. These people, and this is basically pertaining to the amnesty period, these people need more time. These are people that are of an older generation that aren't able to go back into the workforce. They're dependent on this income. And for an amnesty period that you're kind of saying is not really necessary to have a time limit, I think is false. I think we do need to have that time period for these people to actually take a look at their situation. If they need to sell the house, what they need, if they need additional income, where are they going to go and get that? We can't put these people just on the streets. So I really advise you to take a look at that period, take a look at 2-3 years to give these people time, I think it's really important. I also feel that, and reiterates to what my colleague was up here, Ms. Meek, in regards to the subpoena, I really think that it is a violation of our rights. I think we really should take a step back at that, take a look at that, and I think that's really kind of an important issue that I think I really would like for you guys to take a look at and spend some time with in regards to that. Thank you.
Brian Kenny, David Bolton, then Bob Bartlett.
Good evening, council members. I was going to speak on both of the two issues you're facing today, enforcement and home shares, but your excellent staff report covered most of what I was going to say about enforcement. The only thing I would add would be that one thing you might consider is adding for the zoning information report to be modified to include a statement informing a new property owner of the prohibition on vacation rentals in residential zones. The statement would require the signature of the new owner. The other item under discussion tonight is modifying the zoning ordinance to allow home shares. I would ask each council member to think long and hard before making any modification to the zoning ordinance. Zoning is the foundation that creates the character of our neighborhoods. That is certainly the reason that any changes require a supermajority. Allowing this new commercial activity in our residential zones will increase traffic congestion and noise. It will reduce security and available parking. But more importantly, unless the ordinance is written very tightly, it will provide for the continued explosive growth of vacation rentals in our city. If you listen to the statements of those profiting from vacation rentals at public meetings and in online comment sections, they have every intention of continuing to skirt the law. A home share ordinance will give them the means to do that. If the council decides to modify the zoning ordinance to include home shares, I would urge that you include the following: a permitting process that requires that the owner be present throughout any guest stay. That would have to be the actual owner and not a relative or employee. The guest would stay in the owner's residence and have access to the entire property. The owner would be required to show proof of business liability insurance, initial and yearly property inspections. Any unpermitted living space would result in revocation of the business permit. Limits should be placed on the number of home shares.
Thank you. Thank you very much. David Bolton, Bob Bartlett, Bonnie Raisin, and then Ann Rojas.
Madam Mayor and members of the council, I just wanted to say thank you very much for considering home sharing as an option. There's a need here for middle-level lodging. There are so many weekends when we are sold out in this town, and it's not just during Fiesta. Dozens of times throughout the year I hear from those that inquire about staying. They can't find a hotel, we're sold out. And when you look at the 1,000 vacation rentals, we're not just talking 1,000 people, we're talking 2,000 to 4,000, because I've never once rented to a single person. It's been a family of 4, it's been a couple. We're a tourist town. Our economy is tourist driven. There's no other large enterprise here that's keeping this town open when we look at restaurants and everything. And when you take away 4,000 people on a given weekend, how that's going to affect our downtown restaurants. The majority of the people in Montecito, they don't come into downtown State Street to go to our restaurants. They stay there, they go other places. We should really look at the economic impact citywide, how this is going to affect if we cut out that level. You can't find on many weekends a hotel in this town for under $300 or $400. We're going to cut out a large group of people. I have a lot of people that come from the Central Valley, Bakersfield, and Fresno. They are not going to spend $400 for a 3-night stay. When they spend the $1,500 for the weekend, that could be equal to their rent where they're from. One other thing I would like to say is I also don't think it's fair that the city does selective enforcement. Why is there such an effort on vacation rentals, especially those that are paying their taxes, when you can go to the east side or the west side and see dozens and dozens of garages illegally converted to units, and there's not the same effort of enforcement on that? I don't understand how we can do selective enforcement on one area of the community, especially an area that's got a business license and is trying to do things correctly. Anyways, thank you so much.
Bob Bartlett, Bonnie Raisin, Ann Rojas, and Barry Keenan.
I am an owner of a vacation rental, a home. I started my vacation rental in 2006. At that time, I wasn't aware that it was a zoning violation. I wasn't aware that I had to pay TOT tax. In 2008, I inquired with zoning, and they told me it was a violation, but only enforced if a complaint is received. That was told me at your zoning department on Garden Street. In 2009, I received a nice little package from your finance department downstairs telling me that I had to pay the TOT tax and that I had to get a business license specific to vacation rentals. And it says right on it, vacation rentals. It is the city that has created the situation of vacation rentals operating in violation of zoning while being issued a legitimate business license and paying a very substantial tax. It is the city that's done that. As such, I think the city owes those of us that have a business license and have been paying the tax a fair amnesty period. An amnesty period by decree, not by de facto, as the staff is telling you to do. At the June 23rd meeting, I heard Councilwoman Murillo mention a 2-year period of amnesty for those of us that have been paying the tax and with business licenses. I think we should get at least that. At least that. I think you're making a mistake not letting these happen. I have a family in my house right now. It's grandparents, it's aunts, uncles, grandchildren, and it's a wonderful place for them to gather. This is a...
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you. Bonnie Raisin, then Ann Rojas, Barry Keenan, and Howard Green.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and City Council. My comments will be brief because so many people have covered this, but as a realtor for many, many, many years, I very rarely hear the term private property rights anymore. I guess they still exist, that a man's castle is his home and that he should, by the very nature of his deed, be able to do what he wants to do with it. However, since government increasingly encroaches on that right, and it is the way it is, I'm concerned not only about that, but also the concept of issuing subpoenas to websites. That does not sound good. It sounds like restraint of trade, or if there's a better term for it, I think you might be in trouble down the line for that. I think it's draconian to disallow vacation rentals. I've talked to many young couples, and not just young couples, who could not afford to come to Santa Barbara, but who go out and spend a lot of money in the restaurants and the bars and the markets. I just think that there's a fuzzy area here. I can understand how neighbors feel, but on the other hand, were they to be in the same situation, I would ask them to put themselves in the shoes of people who can realize that income and who I think with some conversations would probably honor any complaints about their neighbors. That, to me, would be the best tact. But tonight, I would highly, highly recommend that you do not consider this ordinance. Thank you.
Ann Rojas, Barry Keenan, Howard Green, then Paul Naiman.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and City Council. I've been operating a home share rental for about 1.5 years, and I'd like to take a slightly different tack. More than half of our visitors are Europeans, and they have money to spend in Santa Barbara, and very often they need some orientation of what to do. Of course, everybody always wants a good Mexican meal, so we send them down to our favorite places on Milpas, and in a weekend they will have an average of 6 to 9 meals out. They also go whale watching, kayaking, wine tasting. So there's a lot of added revenue to the city besides the TOT and business license that we have. We allow 2 or 3 persons. They park in the driveway. Many of my neighbors don't even know that we're doing this. That's how discreet it is and how quiet it is. We think that we're an asset to the city. Many of the Europeans have never been in an American home. They've been to New York, San Francisco, Las Vegas, but when they come to our home, we treat them as guests, and they love their visits in Santa Barbara. We've made excellent friends, and they have a very good opinion of Santa Barbara when they leave. Thank you.
Barry Keenan, Howard Green, Paul Naiman, then Michael Hoffman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and council members. My name is Barry, and I have the good fortune of living in a neighborhood that has multi-million-dollar homes. We got into the home sharing business primarily because we built a very expensive guest suite to our existing home for the grandchildren, friends, and what have you. As we've gotten older, friends are dying off. They're getting too feeble and so this beautiful guest facility was sitting idle most of the time. We, as an experiment, went into the home sharing business. We are on the property when our guests are there, and the benefit to introducing Santa Barbara to a lot, particularly Europeans and Canadians who prefer and are way ahead of most American communities when it comes to home sharing. And they prefer that to a hotel stay. That's just their preference. And there's, people that stay in expensive hotels and less expensive hotels based upon the type of experience they're looking for and can afford. I would just urge the council to take a very close look at R1 zoning as not necessarily leprosy. There's 3 VRBOs in our neighborhood. One of your council members lives in the neighborhood and can attest that the problem level is none. In fact, our neighbors are much happier now that we don't have the grandchildren and friends from another state coming in constantly and partying with our friends. And knowing the entrepreneurial spirit of most Santa Barbarans, that people are going to figure out a way to circumvent any laws that you pass. So it's very important to be sure of your regulations and permits that are issued. Thank you.
Howard Green, Paul Naiman, Michael Hoffman, Theo Cracky.
Madam Mayor, council members, I don't come as a homeowner, as a person who has a vested interest in this, and I understand the dilemma that the city has. It can't ignore the zoning ordinance. And to the degree that recommendation D is to initiate home sharings, but not vacation rentals, it seems like you're trying to cut the baby, and I'm not sure it's the right way. I have a concern on item 16 also. How do I handle that? The subpoena.
Right now.
Right now? Okay. The definition that is on page 2 of vacation rentals, I think, is defective in that, and I realize it's not to be passed tonight, but it excludes the situation where people rent their houses out for events. Weddings would be an example. A nice home in the Riviera may want to provide their facility for wedding guests. And so I think if you change the definition, guests pay a fee for usage, instead of saying a nightly fee, it would allow a little broader interpretation. The other omission is exchanges. Somewhere this came up. I don't think exchanges are for a fee, but I think that they need to be recognized in the process somehow and covered. Regarding subpoenas, I believe council used a number of about 90. I don't know whether that includes Expedia or some of the other hotel rental sites. Are they going to be subject to this also? Are they going to be having to supply customer information? The tax is on the individual who attends, not or stays, rather, I think, than on the owner. So I think there's some
Thank you.
security.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Paul Naiman, Michael Hoffman, Theo Kraki, and Todd Jacobs. I'm sorry, your name's Paul, so you're giving Michael Hoffman your time and your, okay, so you have up to 4 minutes, and then Theo Kraki.
Thank you. Well, we have that term, never touch a running system. Is the system actually failing, that we need to touch it, that we need to rectify something, that we need to change something? I'm not quite sure about that. The number of complaints show us, at this point at least, the system is not really failing. That we have so limited space in this town, it's a fact. Santa Barbara has the ocean, the mountains, and there's just limited space in between. You can only do so much. When I started my business with the vacation rental, I went downstairs and I said, I would like to do this. What do I need to do? And the ladies who are very kind down there said, oh, it's an easy thing. Fill this in, pay your fees. Here is your business license. You are official. And on my business license, it clearly states vacation rentals, and I've been doing this, and I've been paying my TOTs. All of a sudden, I realize, and I never heard about that before when I inquired downstairs, that I'm doing something that is against the zoning policy. Well, there was some misinformation from downstairs, but something somehow went obviously wrong. I'm looking at the zoning at this point. When the zoning was put in place, did we think of home sharing at the time? Are we really thinking residential 4 is okay, residential 3 is maybe not okay? Just in my situation, I live on Olive Street, and the left-hand side of Olive Street is residential 4. I'm unfortunately on the right-hand side, and all of a sudden I'm violating the zoning. Maybe it's something we need to reconsider. I'm having nice families coming in who otherwise could not enjoy Santa Barbara, especially German families who come because there's the German connection, obviously. And they say, well, we could not afford Santa Barbara unless it was for vacation rentals. So this is a nice place for us to be. Also for reunions, when people come, they always praise me. And when I look at my reviews on Airbnb, it's not complaints of the neighbors against me. It's actually complaints of my tenants saying, oh, the neighbors next door were too loud. The high school was too loud. The bowl, we could hear the bowl until 10 o'clock, and it was loud. I didn't get any complaints, but it is my guests who are complaining about noise issues. So I'm not quite sure what we are doing here. I would like you to consider taking one step back, looking at the problem, if it is a problem, and researching it before we go any further. And I appreciate the time I had. Thank you.
Theo Kraki and Becky, you're going to waive your time? Yeah, so Theo, you have up to 4 minutes, and then Todd Jacobs, Samantha Ireland, and Glenn Davies. Good evening.
Hello, Madam Mayor, City Council members, staff. My name's Theo Kraki. I'm a 34-year resident of Santa Barbara. Most of you all know me. I want to talk in two parts. Real briefly, I just want to make a quick comment on the reasons that we're all here. I've been to the big hearing that we had on June 23rd. I've been to the 2 county meetings that they're exploring this subject. I was at the Carpinteria City Council meeting last night. There's really 2 arguments that the public makes about why there should be no vacation rentals. The first one is the shortage of affordable housing. And I have yet to hear anybody give any firm evidence that short-term rentals are a leading cause of the significance or the shortage of affordable housing. There's no evidence. No one's saying this. There's lots of other reasons. Certainly it contributes a little bit, but is it a leading cause, and is it a reason to do such drastic enforcement so quickly? The other thing I keep hearing, too, is that short-term rentals cause the degradation of residential neighborhoods. But again, there's no hard evidence that they're doing that. Sure, there's some stories, anecdotal neighbors that are complaining they've had bad experiences, and I respect and really am sorry for the experience they had and what the negative it's had on our industry. But the only evidence was given by the city staff, which was that there's 60 complaints in 10 years. That's not a crisis. It's a very minor problem. So these two premises that have been this catalyst for this major drastic undertaking are questionable. And I agree with a lot of the speakers that have said, this has been moved very quickly and gone very fast and too fast. So don't know if it's possible to step back. Don't know if it's possible to kind of reconsider where you've gone with this. But if at all possible, slow it down as much as you can. So that's the first part. The second thing is that I want to talk to why we're here, which is the report staff did about the enforcement of this issue and how it's going to be all implemented. I thought it was well researched. I thought it was reasonably presented and offered some good options. The only thing I really take issue with, and I think is not the best approach, is the idea that there's a loose idea for those of us that are in Category 4 and 5 who have been paying TOT, have business licenses, have this kind of loose idea of when we're going to get enforced against. I think it's very important to give a firm deadline, give the amnesty that we deserve, because and there's several reasons for this. We need to plan. Owners bought houses, they furnished houses, they put a lot of money into them, investing this with the very low risk of getting their business shut down because of a neighbor complaint. That was the agreed upon conditions, and the city sanctioned that by issuing a business license and accepting the TOT taxes. Suddenly they have, with this ordinance and with this action to enforce, all of that investment's really at high risk. And they need some time to unwind that. They need some time to earn that money back to kind of get out from that. And I hate to say it, but several owners have had legal counsel, and some are saying that it's not even, they feel like they have a legal case against the city for sanctioning this activity. And also, yet understanding it's a zoning violation. There's some principle, I'm not sure exactly what it is. But anyway, so there's that. I think owners need to have a firm deadline, and I think it should be at least 2 years, and then it can start being enforced. The other thing is my staff. I hire 20 people locally. I'm probably going to have to lay off half of them because of this. If we do lose all these properties to this ordinance, my staff needs to have time to transition. They got to find new jobs. They got to figure out how they're going to pay their rent. They got to do all this other stuff. So we need to unwind our own business that's been built around offering a service to homeowners. By the way, I've heard some comment about agencies and managers are the problem. We're not the problem. We're a facilitator for people that want to do this business. And it's from all the comments I heard at the first hearing, it's a very important business to many, many people. Not everybody wants to.
Thank you.
Oh, that's my 4 minutes?
That was 4 minutes.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Todd Jacobs, Samantha Ireland, Glenn Davies, and the final speaker will be Bradley Bennett.
Thank you. I wanted to say a couple things about all the folks that have spoken about how their neighbors aren't affected. I'm a neighbor, and I am affected by the VRBO in our neighborhood, and they're all over the place. Specifically, next door, the home to mine in the E1 single-family neighborhood has been subdivided into 4 units. 2 of them have been rented regularly. And right now, I think there's 2, maybe 3 regularly rented units plus VRBO stuff going on. There's a lot of cars. Our cars have been hit twice by hit and runs in the last year. Noise all the time. Smells like pot smoke regularly. We're just trying to raise our kids there and get a night's sleep, and it's hard. I think that so I am against home sharing, and I'd like some definition as to how far that goes down the slippery slope. Does the owner, if the owner's there, can they rent 3 separate units on the property? Can you add a kitchen? Can you add a bathroom? How many units can you make out of in an E1 neighborhood that can be rented separately? Also, I think that the enforcement priorities need to be thought about. Just because somebody's been paying their VOT shouldn't put them in the 4th tier. If there is a complaint, if a house is a serial problem, if it's affecting the neighbors in the neighborhood who are just trying to live their lives in their home, that should be an enforcement priority. And the last thing about the VOT is maybe I misunderstood, but if $1.2 million has been collected from VRBO-like rentals, I think that should all go back into the enforcement and the management of VRBO, not just the portion that the city planning department is asking for now for extra staff for the administrative part and the enforcement part. So maybe I misunderstood that, but if there's money on the table that's coming in from VRBO, it should go back out to keep the people who live in this city from having to deal with the problems associated with it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Samantha Ireland?
Good evening, Madam Mayor, council members. I'm Samantha Ireland, and I own Vacation Rentals of Santa Barbara. And I have owned it for about 10 years now. So I've been through the whole process of the city condoning and sanctioning these vacation rentals. I did go through the process to set up all of my properties with the city's guidance to do it the way that they instructed us to do it. And I have very good compliance, as the city can attest to. And I just want you to remember in this whole process, the tourist. We set up these businesses to provide a service, and they booked with us in good faith. And if we don't have a clear amnesty period, then people's vacations, their plane tickets, their weddings that they're coming for, they're going to be out of luck. And how can we do that as a city when the city sanctioned the activity and allowed me to provide this service to these people that are coming from out of town? So I would just ask that you slow down a little bit, think about all the requests for the amnesty period, and make that very concise. Again, I'm not sure what the rush is. I know that this can be a good product, that we're providing a good service for the city, and I don't know why there wasn't more research done. Other cities took the time to do the economic impact study. As I mentioned before, Galveston's half our size, and the economic impact of vacation rentals to their city is $283 million.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glenn Davies?
Good evening. I hadn't intended to speak tonight, but you obviously need a problem solver. If you've got weddings that can't be held in vacation rentals, or you have guests that can't be housed, the legal lodging industry is not at maximum capacity. You have new hotels coming online, and we are definitely not at maximum capacity, and we can accommodate all of the vacation rental guests, and we will pay bed tax on it. I would argue against a long amnesty. We in the lodging industry have spent decades after decades of investing, not a year or 2 or 6 months. And those investments are being harmed this summer by VRBOs and by home shares. You will find when you get your bed tax numbers that the hotels are suffering this summer. The occupancy is down. The loss of 1.2 million bed tax, that argument is false. That's diverted from the legal lodging industry, and that's you're not going to lose all that. If you have guests who are complaining about noise from the high school or the county bowl, send them to a proper lodging property that's in the correct zone and doesn't have those kind of problems. And I would suggest that you restrict, if you do home lodgings, I suggest you restrict them to the same zones that where appropriate lodging facilities are appropriate, where in the proper zoning. Let's see. One problem with a home lodging is, how do you determine that is a person's legal residence? Are they going to have to vote there?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bradley Bennett, be the final speaker.
Hello, my name is Brad Bennett. I'm a resident of Santa Barbara for 45 years. I spoke with you previously in the previous public hearing. To preface my comments, I'm going to say that I am not in favor of action to disallow vacation rentals. Evidence available does not suggest that vacation rentals are a significant impact on, and I say specifically significant impact on affordable housing. Also, the police records, which have been spoken about here a couple times tonight, that have been shared, do not support that vacation rentals are a significant public nuisance. In my experience and in response to a gentleman that spoke 3 or 4 speakers ago, the excessive cars and pot smokers and things are more commonly associated with student housing, long-term rentals, excessive cars of people cramming into a single-family residence in town versus vacation renters, which in my experience tend to be very respectful families and whatnot that are coming here to enjoy the city. In response to the suggested action, I would like to suggest the following or ask for clarity in your process as you go through as it relates to home sharing. What is the definition of a home share? Does that mean that someone needs to live on site 100% on the residence or just be the primary resident? If I have to travel on business or family vacation for a few days here and there, does that somehow constitute a violation just during that period of time where I'm out of town, especially if I have to be called out of town but I have previous commitments to people to share my home? People that own a home in this town and reside here 30, 60, 90, 100 days out of the year, but then have homes in other communities, they are technically sharing their home. What would they do with the excess time when they're not here that would just sit idle otherwise? I think that constitutes a fair sharing of a home.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. That concludes the public comment. I want to thank everyone for allowing us to focus on what was being said. And so it's to the council. I'm going to start with the question, another term, I guess, which is a home exchange, where there's no money exchanged. People swap from wherever to wherever. What's our stance there? Is that there's a complaint? What if there's a home exchange? There's a neighbor complaint. How does that get enforced? Can you comment on
Madam Mayor,
that?
members of the council, with respect to home exchanging, in the last council agenda report that we provided for the June 23rd meeting, we were clear to indicate that it was not our intent to regulate home exchanges. That was one person exchanging with another. Money typically does not change hands, and so there's no financial transaction. Therefore, it's not triggering the TOT payment or anything like that.
Okay, so if there's a home exchange and there's a neighbor complaint, then just general noise ordinances and that kind of thing would be
enforced through
police
department,
just like
code
any
enforcement.
other noise party kind of thing anywhere else. Okay, all right. So we'll make that clear. Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. First, a question: how long has the city been licensing VRBOs? I mean, we've heard people come up here and say they've been doing it for 10 years or...
Yes, we have a representative from the finance department back in the audience, and she doesn't have a recollection of when we started doing that, but
I think
roughly
it's been
4
during
years.
4 years?
It's been my tenure. It hasn't been longer than 10 years because...
It's been about 2008, 2009 was when the conversation with the city council was.
Okay. One of the valid points that I think people have raised here is, and I realize that there's a legal precedent for cities or other governmental entities charging taxes for illegal activities, but it does tend to create the impression that those activities are sanctioned, whether they're illegal or not. And so I do think something that we have to talk about. I understand the concept of prioritizing enforcement, but I also think for the people who have conformed that some kind of set amnesty period needs to be part of this discussion. And I believe that because I think there's truth to the argument that the city has appeared to sanction this by its own actions. So that's something I think we need to come up with. As to this concept of home sharing, I wasn't clear exactly what we were talking about when this first came up, but it sounds like what we're talking about is VRBOs except the owner is there. And I see a lot of problems making a distinction there. I mean, either we're saying that short-term rentals are a commercial business that is not allowed in the zoning ordinance in all of these residential zones, including all the single-family zones and the R2 and R3, or we're not. I personally don't understand how we're going to come up with some clear distinction here. And I imagine this is going to be an enforcement nightmare. So to me, I think it's either on or off. And I don't understand why we would be looking at changing the zoning ordinance in the single-family zones in the R2 and R3 to allow a home-sharing commercial activity when we're not allowing VRBOs. I completely understand the entrepreneurial incentive to do this kind of business. I get that. And the question we have here is very similar to the question that we come up in almost any kind of development controversy in Santa Barbara. The reason Santa Barbara is such a desirable place, it's not just the weather, it's not just the mountains, it's not just the ocean, it's a history we have here since the 1920s of very strict zoning, unlike almost any other place in the United States. And that very strict zoning is what has created this very desirable environment. When I first came here to go to college back in the early 80s, it was like stepping back into the California that I'd grown up in as a child. And the reason for that is because we have these very strict zoning laws. And those very strict zoning laws have one side effect. They make property here very expensive, very hard to buy. It's a trade-off. There are other places that people can live that don't have these kinds of restrictions. So either we're going to have those restrictions, and we get into this situation all the time. We have developers who want to absolutely push the limits and go over the limits because it's very desirable to build as much as you can in this beautiful environment. And the VRBO situation is very similar. And I absolutely understand what people are saying when they say, look, we've got this very well-maintained house, nobody complains about it. I'm sure that's true in many, many cases. But it also changes the character, and it will absolutely change the character over time of residential neighborhoods when you have commercial businesses. They are burgeoning now, and if that's the choice we want to make, if that's what we want, we will turn Santa Barbara eventually into an almost exclusively tourist zone. That's the choice we're making. So from my point of view, if we're not going to have VRBOs in town, and that makes sense to me, because that is the zoning ordinance, that's the history of this city, I don't see how home sharing will work either. So that's my view on this, and obviously the council's able to do whatever it wants to do on this, and we can explore whatever ordinances we want to explore, but I don't see how it'll work. Thank you.
Mr. Hart?
Well, I think the thing that wasn't spoken to enough in this discussion is the housing crisis that we really face as a community. There just aren't the people in the room tonight that are facing that on a daily basis speaking to us. And, I can just tell you, as a council member talking to lots of different people in the community, that issue is crushing people. And it is different today than it was just a few years ago. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but the effect on people's lives, the real effect on people's lives when you do not have a place to live and your home is being changed from a long-term rental to a vacation rental is devastating to the backbone of this community. The people that are working here that have lived in Santa Barbara for a long time are finding their very livelihood and existence threatened. And yes, there are a lot of contributing factors to that. The growth in students at City College and UCSB is an element of that. And we're wrestling with that in not very effective ways. There's another elephant in the room in that regard, too, which is the growth of the English as a second language schools and what that's happening. And we, frankly, haven't really even talked about that. But that is increasingly becoming a part of this. But it isn't fair, and it isn't realistic, and it isn't honest to imagine that the 1,000 units of vacation rental properties is not also a significant part of that issue. And that, I think, to me, is what motivates me more than anything to have a sense of urgency about that, because that is within our purview. And we had a zoning ordinance that made that illegal all along. And the city was complicit in exacerbating this problem by going down a path where we asked people to get business licenses and we collect the transient occupancy tax. And we clearly sent the signal to people that this is a gray zone. And folks moved into that gray zone and thought they were doing something that was appropriate, particularly when they were paying taxes. Now, the truth of the matter is 2/3 of the people that are doing this aren't paying taxes, didn't get business licenses, don't have any standing to speak of in terms of they did the right thing. So that has to be recognized too. 2/3 of the folks that are doing this business in residential neighborhoods where it isn't legal never even asked and never cared about following the law. So the people that are here, and I know you are representing, your position with good faith. The people that you're bringing into our community are good people. That's all without question. You've brought your point of view into the room respectfully. Totally appreciate that. But we have the job here of looking beyond that vision and seeing how this is affecting our community. Councilmember Francisco is right. There's money here. There's lots of money for economic activity. But if we go down this path without our eyes wide open, we could do this everywhere. Every residence in the city could be a tourist facility. Mr. Cracky is saying, no, that's not possible. There's probably a limit, on demand. Well, this is my turn. I've been sitting here listening for a while. But there is, I don't know where that limit is. It could go very, very high. It could be the vast majority of residential units in this city turned into hotels, essentially, because there is a large demand for that in this community, because this community is unique. So, I feel really, really uncomfortable with the hypocritical situation that we find ourselves in today. I struggle with this enforcement strategy that talks about a couple of years to go through this. I think there has to be some way that we send a notice to everybody at the beginning saying things have changed from when we asked you to get a business license and pay TOT to we're not going to let you do this ongoing. And now I understand that this is resource constrained in terms of how we're effectively really going to manage people who continue to do this in spite of that notice. I'm open to spending more money to eliminate some of that resource constraint. If that is truly the limitation, maybe we need to find a different sweet spot, or maybe we need to check in more sooner than what was originally imagined coming back in mid-year 17 to see how this is going and how the marketplace is responding to that. I could be convinced that there would be a set amnesty period, because I do understand, that we are not of clean hands in this regard. But I'm not, in my mind, thinking in terms of years. I'm talking in terms of 6 months or something like that, long enough for people to rationally wrap up transactions that they, entered into. But there shouldn't be anybody doing this going forward. There shouldn't have been anybody doing this going forward from when we had the meeting, a month ago or whatever it was. Now that's where I strongly feel about this issue. Now, the other side of the coin, and this is the reality of making hard decisions like this, there is some gray area here, and that is regarding people who go on vacation for a couple of weeks, who want to exchange their house or maybe even rent their house for that kind of a situation. I don't know that we need to throw everything out in that regard. I think there is some reasonable place in there where people might be able to do that, because I think people are going to do that anyway. But I am very concerned, as Councilmember Francisco mentioned, about the slippery slope that represents. I don't know how we're going to define home sharing in an effective way that we can have enforcement. I wish this was a simpler time before, the ability to do this stuff through independent companies, through websites. There was a natural friction to this that made it manageable. It wasn't so easy and simple and unconstrainable. But today it is like that, and that's what we're dealing with. So I don't know if things that might have been able to be worked out in a regulatory environment of the past will necessarily apply in this situation in the future. So I'm open to a conversation about how we might define these hope sharing things, but I'm going to be very, very cautious and skeptical about the ability of us to really do that. And I'd be looking for interesting models and examples in other communities where this has been more successful. I'd look to the operators of these businesses who might find some niche or some way to participate in the regulatory environment that would be more successful. I'm interested in what my colleagues think about this. This is not clear and black and white, but it's a huge deal. And it really, the thing that echoes the most to me is the housing crisis that we face. You know, when you really think about Santa Barbara politics, certainly for the 50 years plus that I've lived here, it's always been about growth. You know, trying to find the right balance point between protecting our natural and our man-made environment that has made this place so special, and at the same time having economic activity, providing housing for employees, you know, keeping this thing in balance. And we are out of balance at this point, to the point where it isn't working. You know, our true base of economic vitality is our ability to have people live here and work here and then make that work. And if we threaten that, that is not the Santa Barbara that has been fought about for the past 40 years. And that's what our job, I think, primarily is to protect that community that has existed here in a special way for a long time. And that is an awesome responsibility, and this is not an easy issue.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I own a business that would greatly benefit from having more and more people packed into town all the time as tourists. And that would be great, but I also have responsibility as a council member to do what's right for the neighborhoods. And I've lived on my property for 30 years and on the Mesa, and the Mesa is a mixed bag. We have a lot of renters, we have long-term homeowners, we have VRBO, watch kids grow up. I've watched all the things go on in my neighborhood over the years, but what were my expectations buying the property that I bought? I bought in a single-family residence. I bought with the expectation that would always be the use of that neighborhood. It's not a business district. My business is in a business district. My home is in a residential district. You know, somebody else talked about property rights and what are individual property rights. Well, there might be the right to use your property in the way you see fit, but there's also the right you have to enjoy your property the way you bought it. You bought a property with the expectation that the use in your neighborhood would be what it is. The guy next door isn't really supposed to have a moped shop. And you're not supposed to be in a hotel zone unless you bought down in R4 next to something on West Beach or wherever you bought. So there's a reasonable expectation of that. Some people talked about the European model. I remember what originally were B&Bs before B&Bs became popular here. And it's where you're upstairs and maybe you had to wait for Nigel to get out of the bathroom and then you join the family for breakfast downstairs. That was home sharing. I don't think that's what anybody has in mind in this model that we're kind of kicking around right now. We're looking for a way to split the baby, and I'm having a hard time imagining what that's going to be. People talked about hard evidence and number of complaints, and zoning violations are often, or more often than not, enforced on a complaint basis. But neighbors go to their homes not wanting to play policeman or enforcement officer. And we certainly know from sitting on the dais up here that we get to see a lot of neighbor versus neighbor complaints that go all the way up to the appeal process and things that actually are petty arguments that blow up into something bigger. And most of us don't go home looking for a way to confront our neighbors. When it gets that bad, it's usually beyond the pale. So the enforcement action based just on neighbor complaint only doesn't satisfy my idea of a peaceful, quiet use of my home and property. In terms of us, the city, and what we've done, I complained, and I don't know when it was presented, maybe you remember, Paul, back 9, 10 years ago, the idea of actually looking at people that were doing this for a business and collecting TOT. At the time, I asked the question whether or not it was legitimate to do this. And yes, legally, it's something we have standing to do. It never passed a smell test. It didn't then. It certainly doesn't now. So how does that relate to you? We've tacitly let this go on. It never was legitimate. We never told anybody that it was okay, but it's something that we've done. I don't like the idea of a drawn-out amnesty period for 1 minute. However, it may be where we have to go, at least have a defined one because of what we've tacitly caused. But really, this has gone on in this town for, I've been on my street for 30 years. I've been in town since 1972. But the Airbnbs, the different management companies, whatnot, blew this out of the water. It became so lucrative and so popular, and people solicited private property owners to say, hey, what are you doing with your house when you're on vacation? It could be making money for you. And every property owner property owners turn into entrepreneurs. And yes, maybe that's the way you can stay in your home. Maybe that's the way that the woman in New Jersey that wrote us today said, hey, if I can have this property and we want to come out there 3 weeks out of the year, well, that's not why we're here. That's not the R1 that we designed. That's not the zoning that Mr. Francisco talked about earlier. That's why we are. If we're going to lose what we are, if we're going to be Mission Bay or Newport Beach Peninsula, then we need to go we can go that direction. That's not the Santa Barbara that I'm responsible for helping to oversee. So this is not an easy question at all, but I don't think we have the ability to go and try to split the baby and make something that's halfway. I think it's got to be one way or the other, and I think it's got to be a defined amnesty period if nothing else. I think that's the best we can do.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Remember the principle we made this decision in complete unity last time it was before us, which was the preservation of neighborhoods and the enforcement of zoning, and that question hasn't changed. So any discussion we have comes on top of that decision in my mind, and I think from what I hear from my colleagues, it's the way they feel also. Clarity, though, I think is a fair thing to ask and demand, and I would suggest perhaps for an amnesty that some of you, maybe all of you, have booked through the holiday season of this year, and that starting the 1st of January, that's when we start enforcing, so that you can at least fulfill the obligations that you've made through the holiday season. One question I have, and I'd like to ask the city attorney, I'm not sure how we can do this, is that this subject that others brought up, which is, let's say that I'm going to rent or I'm going to go on a vacation for 2 weeks or a month. But I am not conducting a business, but I would like to rent my house out for a limited period of time. Could we write an ordinance that said that somehow that was all right because we're not conducting a business, limit the number of days? My colleagues may think that that's too clouded, but I know a lot of people I think that would appreciate that, benefit from it, and it would not have the effect that we're all worried about degrading our neighborhoods.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, you certainly could write an ordinance along those lines. Enforcement is the concern, and I haven't looked in detail at how other systems that have been crafted along those lines are working. Those that require, for example, 200 days a year of residency before you can rent out a portion of the home. We could certainly look at that. It is a business, though. Pardon me. Yeah. I would add, insofar as the transient occupancy tax goes and our residential zoning goes, it is a business. When you're exchanging money for use of the property for less than 30 days, it is a business.
I see. In closing, I'd say that I don't know anybody who would think buying a home next to a vacation rental was a plus for that home. And I'm being polite when I say that. I think it was a minus. So that's just to illustrate your powerful arguments that you want to continue what you're doing. I understand the economic attraction. It's been very rewarding for a lot of people. But I agree with my colleagues that in this case we need to, as it were, turn the clock back from what's being done in a lot of other places to keep Santa Barbara the way it is. It'll be short-term pain, but I think long-term gain for all of us, including all of you who are wondering how you're going to keep your houses. The value of our properties will continue to accelerate. So anyway, that's how I think we ought to view this. Thank you very much.
Ms. Murillo?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to start by asking, what would it look like enforcement of a home sharing situation? So say we approve home sharing and someone signs up for that and they're doing it. How would we keep checking up on them and making sure that it didn't turn into the empty house that rotates with every 4 or 5 days new guests scenario?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, that's a good question and one that we've researched from other communities that have recently adopted home sharing ordinances. And in our prior council agenda report from the June 23rd meeting, we listed a variety of ways in which a home share might be regulated. We don't have a mechanism or certain criteria to propose for you today because some will be very challenging to enforce were we to go down that road and draft this ordinance. But it could be a matter of a homeowner needing to reapply for a permit every year. If they show that they're in good standing, they don't have complaints, then we could allow them to reapply and continue to, sort of have an annual check-in with them based on some criteria. It could also be more physical standards that we look to make sure they comply with. The quantitative standards would be challenging, I think, in terms of regulating so many days out of a year you do this or that without having thought through all the different ways you might be able to track that. There's definitely some challenges in that, but we are willing to explore those if the council decides that they want us to explore home sharing.
Okay. After the last hearing, it seemed to me that home sharing was a compromise that I know, in fact, I see people sitting in the audience right now who rent out a section of their home and it helps them pay their mortgage, and it's difficult to make a living in Santa Barbara. But if I'm saying that I do not want commercial practices in a residential area, then that does extend to home sharing as well, because it is renting out a piece of your house. It's taking money and changing the character of that neighborhood. And I'm responsible for the quality of life of local residents, not the tourists. So we have seen studies that prove that vacation rentals and home sharing lead to a loss of affordable housing. So if you're renting out that studio as a home share or as a vacation rental, that means it's not a permanent studio for a working person in Santa Barbara. I'm satisfied with staff's statement about amnesty. There's a built-in time period where all of this will be rolled out. But I did hear Ms. Samantha, I forgot your last name, sorry. So if you've rented out something for a wedding in June, right, isn't that when people get married? So maybe summer of 2016, you've already got some things going. I think we should take that into consideration because we did allow this to go forward. There needs to be a time period for people to divest. And those are my comments, as uncomfortable as it is looking out at all of you out there who have made a business of it. It's brutal in Santa Barbara when you don't have a place to live. And like Mr. Hart, it's the housing crunch that drives my decision-making today. Thank you.
So there's the ideal, and I think there's the practical. And I'm listening to my colleagues and obviously also been very much involved with issues related to housing and being able to afford to live and work here my whole life in public service, as well as on the Housing Authority Commission before that. And I think, well, a couple things. That when we were here before and talking about the idea of home sharing, one of my thought processes had to do with the housing crisis and being able to live and work here. And if our concern is, there are two concerns, as was said. There was the zoning and residential use of a neighborhood, issues related to enforcement of being good neighbors. And I think there's a process involved that could be put together to make that work well. And then there's also the issue of the housing stock and not being able to limit the number of units that should be used for a month-to-month rental as a full-time vacation rental. So that's why this housing sharing piece came up last time as, well, if you want to own a home in Santa Barbara, it's very expensive to do so. How is it negatively affecting the housing stock if you're dealing with a home share, if you're in the home, or even if you go away for the weekend or go away for a week, you're not taking up another unit that could be used for another tenant. And in fact, it might be able to help you live and work in Santa Barbara because it's helping you pay your mortgage. I still think that that's worth exploring. I think some of us are along that line of, and I think it goes again to the practical. I think if we just put a moratorium and say that's it, and we say in 6 months, 9 months, a year, there's just not going to be any more vacation rentals in any variety of shape or form, I do think there's going to be an underground market of some sort. And so I definitely don't want to go down that path. And so to do something that is regulated, that goes through a process, I think compliance of if there's a maximum number of days, if people who send in their TOT do so monthly, we get monthly records of the TOT, they could have, how much money did you bring in the month of October, and, how many nights did you rent it out? I mean, that could be part of a report for the vacation rental verify. And if you violate that process, then you're in violation of your license and you don't get it renewed the next year. I mean, I think there are ways that you can deal with compliance of if you want a maximum number of nights. So I still think it's worth exploring a home sharing option. I still think it's worth exploring ways that do the homeowners have to be in the residence the entire time, or can they not be? If they're not there, is there a way to make sure if something should go wrong, someone's responsible who's in the area? Who is that? I mean, I think those are all things that I think are worth exploring. I think it would take away, I think it would also help in terms of the issues brought up about a single-family residential zoning area, of still having a residential zoning area. You're not having full-time vacation rentals that are turning over constantly, because if you have a home sharing option, you have your homeowners who are still there. And some of the emails I get some of the emails where I bought this place, I want to retire there in a few years, and I need the vacation rental to help make the payment so before I get to retire, or I want to be there for 1 month out of the year. If you want to be here for 1 month out of the year, that's fine. Then that's an 11-month lease that you can have on a month-to-month. I mean, that's, Isla Vista does that all the time, or other places, 9-month leases. I mean, there's still ways to allow people to have month-to-month options, and you're still able to collect rental income and still able to live in your house. But there's got to be some, and I'm sure cities up and down, not only California, but everywhere else, is looking at these options. But I think if we just go straight into saying we're just going to ban everything, the internet is not allowing us to do that. I think, 25 years ago, that might have been an easier thing to enforce. The way the new economy is, the way the virtual economy is, it's just way too easy. I think, Mr. Hart, you said it very well. It's way too easy for someone to go online and look up websites and just do an exchange or rent out a place for a weekend. And if we're not part of that process, then we're really getting into a situation where it could be unregulated. And I think the people in this room who are focusing on trying to make something work want to play by the rules. They don't want to own a business that are going to create problems with neighbors, because then they'll lose their business. And I agree. The 2/3 of those properties that are not obeying by the rules are probably not in this room, and they do need to be enforced and shut down. So it's not ideal. It's messy. There's gray areas. But I'm trying to be realistic. I'm trying to be pragmatic here. In terms of timeline, amnesty, all these words, can you put up the slide of the enforcement priorities, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever that was? So I think what Mr. Hart was saying earlier to Mr. Kalan about the noticing, I think, as I understood it, you were asking for, before we start enforcing, well, we're already enforcing number 1. We're enforcing complaints right now. So before we get into number 2, I guess, I think what I heard you say was before you even start the 30 plus a month or however many, you go through your process, you just send out a notice to everyone who is in the business saying, hey, heads up, this is coming. This is the timeline. And I think this may get to this amnesty piece, because what I'm hearing is it's going to take a while to get to number 4 and 5, which is representing most of the people in this room who are doing the vacation rentals. And I think what I'm hearing is they want some assurance, like, well, I don't know, when are you going to get to number 4? Is it going to be 6 months? Is it going to be 2 years? Is it going to be 18 months? And so perhaps putting a timeline of, and being realistic. We're not going to get to enforcement number 3 until 6 months from now, or we're not going to get to enforcement number 4 until 10 months from now, whatever. And we can, just being realistic with our workload, giving some kind of guidance that might help them knowing when we're getting, when that process is moving forward. At the same time, for the home sharing piece, we're moving forward with an ordinance that then may allow for certain components of a home sharing option. So but I think this is a good enforcement priority. It makes sense. I think it's acknowledging those who have played by the rules if we have asked them to. I think it just needs a little more detail in terms of, some sort of timeline. I don't know if the word amnesty should be used, but just know that by, September 2016, we're going to start enforcing if you're in Section 5. At least it gives you some, whatever the date is. So that would be my, instead of calling it amnesty, but I think that's what you're asking for. We're just using the term amnesty. So that would be my suggestion there. And
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
If I might, one way the council can get there is to tell us how to spend whatever money you intend to appropriate. You have control of the purse strings, and so you could say that you don't want any of the money spent on priorities 4 and 5, and that at a future date, let's say next July, you'll consider appropriations to allow that kind of enforcement.
Right. So just to follow up, on a realistic, pragmatic level, to do the enforcement of what you think is out there in items number 2 and 3, how long would that take anyway?
Do you really want to know?
Well, yes, but
I think a long
ballpark.
time. I think
Right.
Because item 2 is dealing with the unknown, and we will go through a subpoena process that will no doubt be difficult. That's going to take months, not weeks. And I wouldn't be surprised to be back here next year midway through number 2.
And I think that's the kind of information people here are asking for. They're saying, okay, I'm paying by the rules. I'm going to do my TOT. I know eventually things are going to be ratcheted down depending on, we might not have 5 votes for a home sharing option. And we might be in a situation where status quo technically is no vacation rentals, period. But I think we need to go through that process and see, where we end up. So, but, at a realistic level, we're not going to get to 4 and 5 until at least July of next year, because it's going to be spending a lot of time working with the 2/3 of ones that we think we know of that are not, that don't have a business license and don't pay their TOT. So just on a practical level. But I think that kind of language somehow, some assurance that way would be helpful. So that would be some of my suggestions. And I appreciate my colleagues talking about, we want to respect the zoning. We do. We absolutely want to respect the zoning and all that means. And when you bought a property, you didn't want a motor home, no motor shop next door or, things like that. And but again, I don't want to set up a situation where there's I don't know, I don't like to use the term black market, but an underground type of scenario, because there could be. And I think we need to at least explore a home sharing option that could make some sense. All right, so we need some guidance here. It seems like, yes, Mr. Francisco, you have some guidance for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I don't believe that there's a majority, let alone 5 votes on this council, that's interested in exploring a home sharing ordinance, but I would urge you to put a motion to that effect if you wish. But in the meantime, I would like to make a motion on item 15A, B, and C to approve those allocations of funds for those purposes. And I would also like to make an additional motion.
Well, let's do one at a time.
Hold on a second. I'm sorry, not an additional motion. Another part of this motion would be to let people know that all the people who have played by the rules, that there's going to be an 18-month amnesty minimum. We might not even get to everything by then. But a clear 18-month amnesty from the time that this is adopted, during which the people who have operated playing by the rules, paying TOT, registering with the city, will continue to be able to operate those businesses. That's my motion.
Is there a second?
I would second. I'd like to offer an explanation, if I could, Madam Mayor. I was listening to your comments about home sharing and trying to figure out what the rule was, and I got totally lost. So if clarity is what we're after, I think that's should be first and foremost. And I go back to Ms. Murillo's definition of, if I'm in a residential area, I don't want a commercial operation next door. And a commercial operation next door is renting out your house or part of it. So one of the things that we were thinking of with home sharing, or actually against vacation rentals, was the increase of traffic, parking, etc. If we have home sharing, we won't have solved that problem, really. It could be just as bad, just to a smaller degree. So I would ask you to think pretty carefully about what you're saying about home sharing.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction in my mind anyway at this point. I'm not saying I'm going to vote for this ordinance when it comes back. I need to see it. But I think there's, if we want to amend the zoning ordinance to allow home sharing, the difference between home sharing and a vacation rental is home sharing, you still have a homeowner who lives, this is their primary residence. They are still part of their community. They're still part of their neighborhood. And once in a while, they may receive funding for people who will stay in their home for part of the time. That's very different to me than a piece of property that is consistently rented out throughout the year to a variety of different people. And they're not residents of the community. They don't go to school here. They don't pay their taxes here. That to me is the difference. And I think it does make a difference in terms of the community relations, the neighborhood relations. I could be completely wrong, but I think it's worth exploring.
But
Hey, may I reply?
That's not what this motion is about right now. So let's hold that thought, because we have a motion about items A, B, and C with the 18-month amnesty. The terms being used, amnesty. I want to ask Mr. Kalan about.
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
Can I try to clarify, just so we
Yes.
all understand what the motion is? The motion is providing the revenue to begin enforcement, and that enforcement focuses on the priorities number 1, 2, and 3 up on the board
Correct.
for the next 18 months.
Correct.
And so that's what we're talking about.
Excellent.
Then, as part of the next year's budget cycle, we can bring back a status report about how that's going and identify funding for potential beginning enforcement for items 4 and 5 after that 18-month period.
Fine. Good. That's what I said.
Correct.
That's what you said. Okay. All right.
Madam Mayor, may I ask Mr. Casey, would it be easier to say, instead of 18 months, the end of 2016? It's about the same time frame. Is that cleaner, or does it matter?
Come on.
Yes, the preference I expressed earlier, Madam Mayor, is that the council authorize the funding only for those first 3 categories, and that you could include a direction that the funding be expended before January 2017. And that would get you to the 18 months roughly. So the appropriation of those funds is good until January of 2017 and may be used only for priorities 1, 2, and 3.
Mr. Francisco?
That would be okay with me.
Okay.
Frank?
So you want to? Okay. So we know what that motion is?
Yes.
Yes? Anything to the motion, Mr. Hart?
Yes, I'm not really comfortable with an 18-month period of time. I understand that there's a resource constraint issue that may make that just practical reality, but I, again, am more open to the idea of increasing resources to change that reality. And I think it's really important that we build in a 6-month check-in on this. I think this is too long a period of time to go without having a feedback loop about how this enforcement strategy is going. I think there's a tremendous variability in the cooperation of these first 3 categories. And I think that we could potentially have lots of people filing complaints that would change our ability to even get into 2 and 3 based on what's been happening. So I think it's just too long to go without a dedicated check-in point. And I would think we'd need to have something come back, a report on the status of this enforcement exercise and effort at the end of this year.
Well, I think we can direct staff to come back and give us 3 or 4 status reports during the entire period that we're talking about.
Well, I guess in that context, I can support the motion, because what it essentially is doing is that by the end of the year, we're going to come back and we're going to get a report from the city attorney that tells us how we're doing with this enforcement strategy, and we can readdress this issue. But what I'm concerned about is by putting on this in the context of this discussion, people are going to come away with this thinking that there's an 18-month amnesty period, and I'm not comfortable in saying that. I think there is a reality of how long it's going to take us to get and enforce this. But I don't want people coming back to us and saying, you said you weren't going to, there was going to be no consequence for us for 18 months. And I don't think that's the message we want to be sending to people.
Madam Mayor, if I could speak to this. So the original purpose of my saying that there should be this amnesty period is I'm looking at the reality of the fact that the city granted people business licenses and said, this is the TOT you have to pay for quite a while. Mr. Casey says since 2008. And I think that people made investments based on that understanding, even though it was against the zoning. And I think that 18 months for someone who's in a business, which is what this is a reasonable amortization time to let them get out of that. It's not like, a house in Santa Barbara is not a depreciating asset, So I think 18 months is ample, and I think also, based on my understanding for what Mr. Cullen is saying, we may not even be able to get to number 4 in 18 months. So I want to give people who have played by the rules some certainty, and they're a minority of the people who are in this business.
Well, if you put the certainty that you're describing at a year, and then we had this 6-month check-in period, to gauge how this is going, I'd be much more comfortable. I understand what you're saying. I agree that there needs to be some recognition that the city has been part of this process and giving people time to wind this down. I think 18 months is more than ample. I think it's overly generous. I think 6 months, to me, would work as well and would be more definitive, but I could compromise at a year.
You can not vote for it.
If I might.
Well, I'm just...
May I add something for Councilmember Hart? The people who got the license and have been paying the taxes, they're in 4 and 5. They're not going to come back and complain, right? They want the 18 months. I'm saying...
They'd want more than that. If
they don't want 16 months or 18 months. Okay,
End of 2016 is the motion at the time.
Through the end of next calendar year.
Oh, right. Okay, right.
If I could speak to that, if I was out there listening to what we're saying here, I'm thinking, okay, I got 18 months, I'm going full bore.
That's what I'm thinking.
So we're not solving the problem. Things are not, it's just going to be.
On the flips, no, I think what Mr. Francisco is saying is the intent behind it is to acknowledge the city's actions up to now of going through making people go through the process of getting a license, paying their TOT. They've been abiding by the rules that have been presented to them. Practically, it's going to take through the end of 2016 to get through enforcement priorities 1, 2, and 3. So just to provide some assurance to folks of when items 4 and 5 will start being enforced. It's just a practical issue. If we want to, and if we want, and we might not even get through 1, 2, and 3 in that period of time, according to what Mr. Kalan's saying. And if we want to allocate more funds, that's what the check-in piece is for, to see if we want to allocate more funds to make sure we can make sure that the items 1, 2, and 3 are being enforced. That's how I'm understanding Mr. Francisco's motion.
And I also want to remind Mr. Hotchkiss of the realities of real estate investments and the costs of purchasing homes and the investments that many people have made in improving homes for these purposes. So we're not, as a city, we're not very sympathetic to small business. And I think that this is a reasonable concession given that in any case, it's probably going to take us longer than the end of next calendar year to even get to Category 4.
Does your motion include anything about the announcement to everybody that's going to be discovered through this process?
I think we can put that in staff direction. I absolutely agree that we should do that.
Well, I'll put that in the motion and I'll vote for it.
I'll put that in the motion.
Okay.
Will the seconder go along with that?
Okay. So the
except I think page 1 tomorrow is going to try to solve that problem.
The motion is to allocate the funds as stated in staff recommendation 15A, B, and C, to have those funds be used to enforce items 1, 2, and 3 in the priorities. That time
through the end of calendar
through the end of
year.
calendar year 2016, we will have check-in dates to council in 6 months and a year, right? And there'll be a notification out to all the vacation rental properties we know of about this timeline. Was that the last piece?
Well, specifically advising them of the fact that the city is going to begin enforcement. Otherwise, they won't get any kind of notice from the city until they're being enforced again. So this is a blanket, let people know that the regulatory world has changed.
Okay. All right. Do we understand the motion, Mr. Hotchkiss?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Sorry. Where does this place the subpoena?
That's another
That's
motion.
the next- we'll vote on that next
That's a
time.
different
Next
item.
topic.
Different item.
Madam
Mr.
Mayor, I
Rouse.
also had a question. In terms of the business license, for all the people who have been trying to play by the rules, so we're no longer issuing new business licenses, that's correct?
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to clarify that. I don't think it needs to be part of the motion, but we're not taking any new business license. So this is
But what
as
about
of today.
current license holders that are going beyond the 12-month period? Are they going to be asked to renew a business license?
Yeah, I believe so. If we're gonna say they're gonna continue to operate under 4 and 5 under the conditions,
Okay,
I think
I just wanna
they
make
should
it
keep
clear
their
this
business
is-
license active and they should continue paying the TOT during this period.
It's a little squishy for me, so I wanted to see if we can get
So
some clarity.
if someone in February of 2016 needs to renew their license should only go towards December 31st, 2016. We just need to know that we don't want to show that there's a license that goes beyond that, right? So okay, that's an internal process. And just also to clarify, if someone's in enforcement priority 4 and 5 and there is a complaint, they move up to enforcement level 1, correct? Okay, I just want to make that clear for people there. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. I'm willing to vote for this motion. Contrary to what Mr. Francisco said, I have done a lot of work on behalf of small businesses. Thank you.
Okay. All right, we know what the motion is. We're clear? All right, it was motion by Francisco, second by Hotchkiss. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, that's unanimous. Okay. Now, let's go on to item D. And I agree that there may not be 5 votes for a home sharing rental by the time it comes back to us. I guess the question for us now is there enough, really technically you need 4 votes today, but you'll need 5 votes to pass an amendment to the zoning ordinance. Do we want to even initiate that process? And I'll just say, by not initiating that process, then we're just saying we're never going to allow home sharing. We're not going to allow that as an option. So that's what we're looking at here. Mr. Rouse.
Madam Mayor, I might suggest another alternative, and that would be to revisit the home sharing option after we have done 1 through 5. Because I think it's to blend the two is going to be confusing at best. I don't see at this point in time a home sharing proposal that's actually going to work, that's not going to violate some part of 1 through 5. So I think if we're going to do that, it has to be after this has been completely.
And when would that be?
Whenever we get done, officially. Whenever all the licenses have been have expired and we're done with TOT, we're done closing the ones that we think are done. And even then, I'm not really sure what it would be. But I think to initiate one now is trying to put a gray area, split the baby measure in place, and I'm not sure how that works.
Okay, Mr. Hart?
Well, I'm not sure how it works either, but I'm open to at least having the conversation about it. I think it is difficult, and I think that there are serious enforcement realities about this, but I think there's a lot of creativity involved here too. So there's the potential for something that could come out of it, and it's worth exploring. There is nothing other than staff time and the advisory committee's times. Well, that's significant, actually. So Mr. Casey's eyebrows go up on that one. But I think it's worth at least trying.
I do too. I think we need to have the conversation. We started the conversation. This is a big part of the conversation. We're going to be moving forward on an enforcement level. It may or may not pass, but we're on a trajectory to have this process. I appreciate what you're saying, Mr. Rouse, but frankly, that's just saying we're just not going to touch it, and we're basically going to ban everything and then start all over again. And again, I go back to practically what's that going to mean in terms of enforcement of something that may go underground. So, Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. So the question I have is, the staff report said that this would go to the Planning Commission in fall. What month is that to you all?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, I believe the soonest we could get to the Planning Commission would be October.
And then, so between now and October, you would work on what you said to me when I asked you about options about home sharing and enforcement and.
Correct.
Okay, I'm willing to have to do the exploration, Madam Mayor.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, it may be worth checking in with council before going to the Planning Commission with an ordinance, because if there's just no interest at that point, why go through the process at that point? So. We'll have to figure out if that's late 2015 or early 2016 or whatever is in your timeline. Okay, so we need a motion. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Quick question to staff. So if we went forward with this Part D, you would explore the positives and negatives of home sharing, the difficulties of enforcing it, licenses involved, whatever. We're not just saying, oh, it's all good, correct?
That's correct.
All right, I can support that. Thank you.
Mr. Hart?
I'll make a motion to approve item D.
Is there a second? I'll second it. So Mr. Rouse was just whispering. Is this I think the term is initiate a zoning ordinance amendment to allow home sharing rentals. I want to be clear that we're not saying we're going to vote for a home sharing zoning ordinance. We're just initiating the process. That's what this is about. So don't feel like if you vote yes on this means that you have to vote yes on or no. Right. Yeah. This is just initiating the process. Any questions on the ordinance, on the motion? Okay. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed?
No.
That just one? So 5-1 with Francisco saying no. Okay. And then item number 16, which is the subpoena issue. Mr. Hart.
I'll move the staff recommendation.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded by Francisco. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Question here. We're talking about subpoena now, right?
Yes.
Judging what we just passed, how would that affect this particular motion, or would it?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, the subpoenas will help us do step one, which is sending out the notice to all the.
So we could proceed right away with this if we approve it?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. That's what I want to know. Thank you.
Can you, there were some questions about privacy and what kind of information you're actually what the subpoena is. If you could just be a little more clear about that, or someone. Mr. Doimus.
Madam Mayor, council members, John Doimus with the City Attorney's Office. In terms of the information we're requesting, we'll just request in terms of the property listings, property addresses, dates of stay. We're not interested in terms of guests or private information on that. We're just interested in solely the information of whether the properties are being rented out and the time period they're being rented out.
Right, so the purpose of it is to communicate with every single entity that might be out there about vacation rentals or home sharing.
The real property owner,
The real
correct.
property owner, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Murillo?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just wanted to clarify for myself and the audience that, so we have not banned vacation rentals here tonight. They're still allowed in E4 or R4, right? So I see some reporters out there, and it's been a long night, and
You want to,
is that
Mr.
right? So the people who are saying that,
Ms. Burke?
Some tourists prefer renting homes instead of hotels. There is still an opportunity for that. No.
I think that's good to clarify, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Murillo. Nothing has changed from your direction to us back in June, which was to continue to enforce existing zoning regulations regarding vacation rentals. And so currently, vacation rentals are seen as a hotel use. They are only allowed in certain commercial zones and the R4 zone. But with that, there is a requirement for a discretionary process for somebody to go through to actually operate legally. So there's a distinction between what uses may be allowed in a zone versus actually having all the land use approvals to operate the use. So I do want to make that clear. There is still a process for somebody to go through in order to operate a vacation rental in those zones.
Thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Well, I think a more proper way of expressing it from a media point of view is that the door is closing on vacation rentals. And that ought to be understood. It's just got a period of time to do that.
Correct. Okay. Do we know what the motion is? We have a motion, right? Okay. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that's unanimous. Okay. Thank you very much. And before we adjourn,